So first of all, a slight caveat or an apology that some of this may feel slightly chaotic because I'm starting to grapple with some of the science of these creatures that live in darkness and how they came to be there. And I'm not quite sure yet whether I've quite understood some of the scientific discourses around that. So in 1874, a member of the Royal College of Surgeons, William Whalley, wrote that the eye was the most intensively studied sensory organ of the day. It was, and still is, considered to be the organ capable of allowing people to appreciate wonder, the principal means through which humans might come to realise the magnificence of their own achievements in the theatres of the arts and sciences. This relationship between the eye as an organ and human ingenuity positioned the eye as a mechanism at the apex of the order of creation across much of the 19th century and beyond. Indeed, evidence of human superiority over the rest of the natural world was often located by many in the very functions and structures of the human eye. The eyes of other animals, in contrast, were generally considered to be simple, rudimentary organs. Darwin himself writes that there are an astonishing number of variations of eye across the natural world, some of the most rudimentary being simply an optic nerve covered with translucent tissue. And he tells us to go and look at the hagfish and the golden mole as examples of those sorts of creatures. William Whalley, in his book on human and animal vision, writes that animals possessing the most acute vision are eagles amongst birds, the salmon amongst fish, the lynx amongst quadrupeds, but certainly the most striking, and that gifted with the most delicate mechanism is possessed and enjoyed by man alone. The perfection of vision, then, was, in Whalley's estimation, inextricably entwined, I think, with the state of being human, of being created in God's image, the pinnacle of a divinely authored world. And this often meant that the differences observed among the eyes of humans and more than human animals were infused with discourses of hierarchy, power, superiority, sometimes pity. Many of these discussions based on the premise that the eye, and the human eye in particular, is designed to be perfect, that vision as humans know it is the best vision possible. And this, I think, may be a fundamentally ableist and human-centric narrative. And I wonder how far ableism and anthropocentrism are entwined in this context. And I think it entrenches a sense of a hierarchy of embodied experiences of the world. One such animal that Whalley examined in his text is the blind cavefish. And he observed that to afford sight to animals inhabiting such dark abodes would be superfluous. Hence these strange creatures, in being blind, resemble insects and other animals which perpetually dwell in subterranean retreats. What exactly did blindness mean for the creatures of the dark, and how did their bodies compensate, in inverted commas, for their lack of vision? And furthermore, what can these discourses tell us about notions of sensory loss in the human realm? This paper tackles these questions, and in so doing, starts to make a case for why we ought to be looking at discourses about animal eyes. I'm going to examine 19th century scientific discourses relating to creatures that have adapted to life in the varying degrees of darkness found principally throughout subterranean cave ecosystems, but I also refer at times to other dark environments too. It considers differing views about how the eye apparently fell into a state of disuse, and how blindness then came to be viewed in some circumstances as an advantage, an evolutionary advantage. Because in many ways blindness was thought about at the same time as scientists considered supersense, and the ways in which lack of vision was compensated for by the evolution of highly specialised extra-visual sensory organs and ways of knowing the world. By looking at these discourses, I think we can identify some ableist narratives of helplessness, regression, degeneration, spanning human and more than human worlds. I'm going to start by talking about a place called Mammoth Cave. I'm going to end by taking us to a place called the Country of the Blind. Mammoth Cave is the longest cave system in the world and has been a locus of zoological interest ever since its discovery by white men in the US at the end of the 18th century. And it's particularly of zoological interest owing to the presence of a huge array of quite distinct microenvironments. It was not extensively opened by explorers until the second decade of the 19th century. And it was eventually established as a series of show caves. It would take up to 12 hours to go through all the show caves at Mammoth Cave. And it was staffed by slaves, who were the ones who gradually opened up these different caves. It was here then, I think, that the subterranean frontier was pushed forward, incrementally across the decades spanning the middle of the 19th century. Now, caves are zones of transition, edge environments or ecotones, not only from light into darkness, but also from one set of species characteristics to another. As people moved into the cave system, and they moved into the darkness, they came across shallow pools and rivers, stalactites and stalagmites, in and on which they located strange fauna, from translucent insects with giant antennae in the fairy grotto and the moonlight dome, to blind fish swimming in the waters of the caves, one or two of the cave's rivers, the Echo and the Styx, as well as in the so-called Crystal Lake. The first published mention of blind cave fish, or the blind cave animals, comes in 1840. Many of these animals, though by no means all, had no eyes, or at least highly atrophied eyes, along with highly developed extravisual organs of sense. So in 1840, Robert Davidson noted that we were informed that a species of white fish were found here without eyes, and the keeper of the hotel at Mammoth Cave assured us he himself had seen them, but that their other senses were so acute, the slightest touch of water overhead was sufficient to alarm them and make them dart off like lightning. He goes on, we were not favoured with a sight of these natural curiosities, which would have been to the full as interesting a spectacle as Prince Bobbin's white mice with green eyes, for which he ransacked the world. And there he's referring to a Chinese fairy tale about a prince who becomes obsessed with collecting white mice, and he must have a particular white mouse with green eyes to complete his collection. In this vein, to begin with, therefore these fish are freaks. They're construed as freakish novelties, and the cave guides are collecting them in huge volumes and selling them to tourists at the cave entrance, who would then take them home. These curiosities attested to the presence of strange entities existing at the very margins of the known world. Now, Harriet Ritvo has written extensively, in particular in her excellent The Platypus and the Mermaid, about efforts to classify the natural world since early modernity. And these kinds of animals, these blind creatures, exist in the very same kind of category as the platypus, because they troubled emerging classifications of nature, which were based predominantly upon the aesthetic of physical perfection. And of course, the possession of vision was part of that perceived state of perfection. And this meant that after their discovery by Western scientists, they were subjected to an intense scientific discussion that still goes on today. Indeed, they became central pillars in ongoing discussions among zoologists around the mechanisms of evolution, and they remain today one of the most challenging and complex problems in cave biology and beyond. How could it be, people wondered, that organs that were imagined in an ocular-centric world to be so vital to surviving and thriving, the eyes, could be lost? Could it be that in their place senses developed that allowed for a different kind of knowledge of the world? Could it be that the world could be known differently? Generally speaking, people suffering from sight impairments they tended to be objects of pity. Blindness seemed to deprive them of access to the joys and wonders of the world. Indeed, William Whalley, who I quoted earlier, ruminated in his text, asking who can adequately describe the fearful and melancholy calamities resulting from the total deprivation of sight. But he goes on from there. And yet, he says, God tempered the wind to the shorn lamb, so he graciously alleviates the afflictions of the blind, for we find that they are in general very cheerful. Not only does he talk about people with sight impairments here as if they are a distinct group, maybe even a distinct species, but he also recognises that people can thrive as well as survive, even in that context of pitying them. This is important because when we look at discourses around blind animals, we see this very duality. One where a sense of lack and deprivation runs parallel to compensation and where collective adaptation becomes the key to life. S.A. Forbes writes in his 1882 American Naturalist paper that, quote, an unusual interest attaches to everything related to the blind fishes of the caves, partly because of their peculiar deprivation and the compensation afforded to it by the development of special sensory structures more useful to them in their special subterranean situation than eyes would be. Some of these creatures were believed to be in possession of a so-called sixth sense, an extension of the sense of touch, which enabled the fish in particular, but also blind crickets and blind salamanders, to feel tiny vibrations in the waters and to perceive wavelengths longer than those of sound which we can normally hear. Environmental contexts were at the heart of this discourse around adaptation, deprivation, and compensation. Surviving and thriving is only possible when environment and body cohere, it seems. European naturalist Jorgen Matthias Christian Schioter classified subterranean animals into groups depending on the levels of light present in each environment. And there was then a clear connection made between the various designs of eyes in animals in caves and the needs of those animals in terms of their survival. This was applied to animals beyond those below the surface of the earth as well, but always again couched in discourses of imperfection on the one hand and compensation on the other. In nocturnal animals, it had been found that their pupils were unusually enlarged in order to let in as much light as possible, and that their hearing was more acute. This discourse of adaptation was present in discussions around the human world too. Indeed, issues around exposure to differing levels of light became part of a racialised discourse in the 18th and 19th century. Blumenbach, for instance, concluded that blue eyes were admirably suited to the northern people, particularly when enveloped in the shades of their long twilight, while the deep black eyes of the Negroes enable them to endure the brilliant glare of the vast sandy deserts and ardent sunbeams of the torrid zone. Much of this discussion around adaptation entailed discussion of compensation for a perceived loss, a particular situation in which people found themselves, or animals found themselves. Whalley writes that the imperfect vision of bats is abundantly counterbalanced by the exquisite delicacy of sensation conferred upon their membranous wings, which serve to direct the animals in their nocturnal flights and movements. So there's this idea emerging that the extra-visual senses become heightened when another becomes impaired, that there must always be this kind of balance maintained. Now, of course, adaptation could go in the other way too, in terms of a supposed ill adaptation to environments. Whalley describes albinos, albinism, of course, occurring in both human and more than human animals. Speaking of the so-called black races, as he terms them, Wally argues that, quote, they generally inhabit warm and damp regions, which prove so inimical to their enfeebled position and condition that they are seldom long-lived, are frequently low-spirited and morose. The retinae are deprived of the natural screen which modifies the light as it falls upon the eyes. The consequence is that the superabundance of light, descending upon these feeble organs, induces a perpetual blinking, thereby imparting to the owner a singular and most pitiable appearance. An example here of a human group that is not well adapted to the particular environment they find themselves in. All of this, spanning human and more than human worlds, is about the degrees to which beings are adapted to thrive, not only survive but to thrive, in their environments, and therefore implicitly denotes those without such characteristics as ill-equipped and fundamentally ill-suited to survival. Understanding these adaptations was also about the desire to comprehend exactly how such creatures had come to be in the first place, and discourses around this perpetuate the convergence of both the onset of weakness and the onset of supersense or superability. Debates around the mechanisms of evolution were at the core of this, and here there were many divergent theories. S.A. Forbes again writes that a strict evolutionist passes perhaps too easily from the idea of the unbroken rayless night in which the blind fishes live and seem to have lived for ages, to that of their atrophied eyes and highly developed epidermal organs of sense, connecting these at once as cause and effect. In other words, that darkness and darkness alone causes these adaptations to arise, and that they do so extraordinarily quickly. It's simply the condition of the impairment of vision that permits survival and then thriving via a system of supersense. But Forbes himself disagreed with that conclusion and argued that there were other species living in cave systems in equal amounts of darkness which do not show signs of adaptation to life in the darkness. Instead, he argued that these creatures show sign of a progressive adaptation, taking place over eons, and depending in large part on the degree to which such animals dwelled exclusively in the dark. So this is essentially that the impairment of vision did not lead to rapid compensation, but rather small incremental steps and adaptations that were passed down through generations, a kind of a cultural learning, if you like, or a learning inscribed on the bodies of these groups of animals. The key here was not only the state of darkness, but also the state of progressive isolation in environments much removed from those of similar species. Edward Drinker Cope, on the other hand, in the US, suggested that the state of darkness led to disuse and, therefore, in his words, retardation. In Cope's theories around evolution, he argued that natural selection could account for the perpetuation of certain traits, but it could not account for the origin of those traits in the first place. And so he advocated a return to Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's earlier theories of adaptation through use and disuse. And this began a movement in the US, especially of neo-Lamarckism. The Lamarckian model of evolution was one that seemed to enshrine the revolutionary tendencies of the day. This was an evolution that came directly from the body, directly from below, not from a struggle, not through violence, as Darwin would have it later. The vocabulary of retardation and regression, of degeneration, is telling here, because it gives away a sense, I think, that loss of vision was in some way a symptom of a halting of progress, and perhaps even a regression into an earlier state, perhaps even a primeval state of existence. Indeed, there were other theories put forward that were explicit about that. that these animals were some kind of survivors from some earlier age, primitive forms of life, not as advanced as the life with which naturalists were more accustomed on the surface. Though admittedly this was not a popular theory. So Cope and a number of his allies argued that this mechanism of retardation was accelerated, and that because of that accelerated retardation, by way of compensation, the antennae and the palpi extended and became more sensitive at the same time. Both these happened quickly and in parallel, so that loss of vision did not lead to immediate extinction. Nonetheless, all of this, I think, comes back to a sense that lack of vision somehow equated to distance from a state of perfection, a distance from a state of civilization, a distance from the apex of creation, a kind of dwelling in the physical and metaphorical darkness. This interesting compensation was tempered by an enduring commitment to the notion that lack of vision equated to weakness. Sciotta again remarked that, quote, "It is difficult to understand the mode of life of cave crickets in this context, or how this slow and defenceless animal can escape being devoured by the rapid piratical arachnidans. Its cautious and slow progress and its timid reconnoitring demeanour fully indicate that it is conscious of life being in perpetual danger, and that it endeavours to the utmost to avoid that danger. However," he goes on, "because in this case darkness was the animal's friend. Darkness, he says, which always favours the pursued more than the pursuer, comes to its aid." This is important because I do think that there are mixed messages here that depict both an animal put in perpetual danger because of its impaired vision, but which has also developed strategies to avert that danger. But at the heart of this, and of special relevance, I think, to the condition of sight impairment and blindness in humans, is the consideration of sight impairment here at a species level. All of these animals have developed collectively, and it was this collective development, this collective work, that was seen to have led to the ability to adapt to life in particular environments to which they were suited. The issue is that these discourses of collective adaptation cannot be applied to individual sight-impaired animals or individual sight-impaired people living in environments to which they are not well suited. And this tells us something about the conditions required, or perceived to be required, for surviving and thriving. Analysis of some of the discourses surrounding blind animals in the Mammoth Cave and beyond has the potential, I think, to tell us much about perceptions of sensory loss, as well as sensory compensation, the notion of vision in people as the perfect sense and as emblematic of civilization, and the circumstances in which beings might thrive in the context of non-normative sensory arrangements. This connection between species, adaptation, and environment here reminds me in large measure of H.G. Wells's novella, The Country of the Blind, first published in the Strand magazine in 1904. The ideas Wells captures and enshrines in this novella parallel, I think, many of the ideas exhibited in 19th century scientific discourses around animals who experience the world through extra-visual sensory configurations. And so, in the final 5 minutes or so of this paper, I want to take us on a short detour to the country of the blind. The novella begins like this: 300 miles and more from Chimborazo, 100 from the snows of Cotopaxi, in the wildest wastes of Ecuador's Andes there lies that mysterious mountain valley, cut off from all the world of men, the country of the blind. Just like the blind cavefish and others, this is an environment isolated from the wider world, at the very margins of it and representing something very other. Another place not fully human and therefore perhaps rather animal in nature. It transpires that a disease did for the sight of the people living in this valley. And just as in the discourses examined, vision is lost in the group as a whole over a period of time. Quote, the seeing had become purblind so gradually that they scarcely noticed their loss. They guided the sightless youngsters hither and thither until they knew the whole valley marvellously. And when at last sight died out among them, the race lived on. I can't help but feel there's a strong sense of speciation here. It's about a collective condition and also a collective adaptation to an environment. Another quote, in all things save sight, they were strong and able. Again, there's this sitting together of weakness and lack and loss, along with alternative forms of living and knowing. At the outset, the central protagonist, Nunez, happens upon the country of the blind, and when he does, we see in plain sight the familiar tropes of weakness, difference, and stark exotic otherness entwined. Quote, the three blind people stood side by side, not looking at him, but with their ears directed towards him, judging him by his unfamiliar steps. They stood close together like men a little afraid, and he could see their eyelids closed and sunken, as though the very balls beneath had shrunk away. He continued, quote, much of their imagination had shrivelled with their eyes, and they had made for themselves new imaginations, with their ever more sensitive ears and fingertips. I think this is really evocative of that discourse of compensation for loss that was so clear in the scientific literature around blind cave animals. It goes on, their senses had become marvellously acute. They could hear and judge the slightest gesture of a man a dozen paces away, could hear the very beating of his heart. Intonation had long replaced expression with them, and touches gesture. And their work with hoe and spade and fork was as free and confident as garden work can be. Their sense of smell was extraordinarily fine. They could distinguish individual differences as readily as a dog can. And they went about the tending of llamas, who lived among the rocks above and came to the wall for food and shelter with ease and confidence. Across Wells's tale, it seems to me, we find a cultural discourse that emphasises both different forms of knowledge of the world, as well as the ways in which we tend to judge experience based on our very own human and normative sense of it. I think that it's this paradox, or rather this complex and confused relationship of recognition of different ways of being in the world alongside a kind of parallel total othering that leads to a building sense of horror across the novella. By the end, the central protagonist Nunez is forced to flee the country of the blind in order to save himself from those who wish to remove his eyes in order to fully civilise him. It's at this point that I think the novella reinforces a faith in the miracle of vision, and that perfect, quintessentially human way of knowing remains at the heart of this story. So our brief journey via Mammoth Cave and via the country of the blind highlights some of the parallels I think we can find between different types of discourse around blind, sight-impaired and nocturnal beings, whether they be human or non-human, in the 19th and early 20th century. We see an extreme form of othering, the conjuring of a notion of a kind of freakish population at the margins of the known world. We see an emphasis on adaptations, loss, and compensations on a collective level. And I think we identify a view that body and environment need to cohere at a species level, when that species was defined by supersensory and or apparently deprived sensory configurations. This has important implications for individuals, I think. In research I've done on the context of zoos, individuals that went blind, whose blindness was not considered to be a normal species characteristic, were considered very differently in this period. Indeed, they were often shot, their suffering deemed to be too much for them to bear. They were also not deemed to be aesthetically perfect specimens of a particular species. So I guess the question this raises is one not only of ableism, but also normativity, and that 19th century understandings of the link between different bodies and their environment depended in some way on the collective, on a collective adaptation where difference ceased to be non-normative, but that was in fact key to survival. And this, I think, speaks to much discourse in relation to the ways in which sight-impaired people have been taught to adapt in an ocular-centric world, and also to the ways perhaps in which deaf cultures developed. In sum, and forgive me for being slightly vague, there's something here, I think, about the connection between sensory loss, adaptation, environment, individual and collective, and the way that they kind of map together. Thank you.